Night fell early on the NBC lot. Inside studio, the world narrowed to a single space made of quiet glass. The crew had stripped the set down to essentials: 2 chairs, a modest table with water and clear glasses. Lester Holt stood at the edge of the light while the floor manager checked the final cues. He wore a dark suit that did not try to be noticed and a tie that suggested calm rather than flair. After decades of storms, he had learned to bring his own weather. He glanced at his notes once more and then set them aside. "Good evening. Tonight we'll be having a conversation with someone special, a modern royal, one and only Meghan Markle." Meghan entered with the carriage of a person who understands that first impressions are a performance. Her posture was careful, chin a fraction lifted, shoulders precise under a tailored blazer the color of clean slate. The makeup was camera honest, the hair a deliberate balance of movement and control. She smiled as she stepped into light and accepted Lester's hand. The smile did not quite reach her eyes. Gratitude is a fragile stage prop. Tonight it appeared on cue. "Thank you for being here," Lester said, the cadence practiced and sincere. "It is always enlightening to be invited to these things," she replied, the vowels polished, the consonants clipped with just a trace of steel. The edge was small enough to miss if you were busy, sharp enough to feel if you were looking. They sat. A camera floated forward on its track and settled into the frame history prefers. 2 faces, 1 table, an invisible country watching. He began where good interviews begin, with open space and uncomplicated verbs. "You have built a different life here since stepping away from royal duties. How has the adjustment been for you?" The word adjustment landed like a pebble on a tense drum. She echoed it, a mirror with teeth. "Adjustment. I did not come here to adjust. I came here to live freely." The line was ready, mounted, and released. Nothing to adjust to when you stop being suffocated. Perhaps the question should evolve. The studio absorbed the sentence with its usual indifference. She tilted her head. The faintest smirk collected at the corner of her mouth. "Why does it always return to the monarchy? Is there any room where I am not dragged back into it? I left. Yet here we are, circling the institution as if escape were a myth and not a fact. Perhaps the media should evolve." The room cooled by a degree. In the control booth, a director lifted a hand to steady a camera that did not need steadying. A graphics producer hovered over a lower third and then decided against pushing it live. The crew did what crews do when the air thickens. They got smaller. They let the shot breathe. Lester's expression did not change. Years had trained his features to live in the eye of storms. "Fair enough," he said. "Let us talk about your family here. You have settled in California. How has parenthood shaped your perspective?" It was a humane pivot. It should have softened the edges. She let out a small laugh that held no amusement. "Parenthood is parenthood. Do you want the fairy tale version? Because if that is what you are fishing for, you will not find it here." He did not argue. I was not fishing. People often find it useful to hear how public figures navigate private roles. That is all. In another studio, on another night, the conversation might have found its way back to the middle. Tonight, the middle kept moving. "I do not exist to inspire strangers," she said. "My children are not content for the public. They are my children, period." The final word hung as a bar. It bracketed the space. Lester's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a fraction of a degree, the kind of movement only slow motion would make obvious. "Understood," he said. "Let us widen the frame. Many are fascinated not only by your current work, but by what you left." He entered the territory that cannot be avoided without lying about the map. "When you look back, did you underestimate the weight of marrying into such an institution?" She froze for a heartbeat, enough for the camera to catch the recalibration behind her eyes. The smile that returned was hard under its polish. "Did I underestimate?" "Number. The problem was never that I underestimated. The problem was that everyone else underestimated me. Do you understand the difference?" He held the silence, letting it show up to the audience like a guest. "I do," he said. "I ask because..." And he did not finish because she did not let him. "Because it is easier to believe I was naive," she said. "Easier to believe I was fragile. I am not fragile." Silence again, this time thicker. The hum of the lights announced itself against the black. He inhaled, the kind of measured breath that weighs words before they are born. "Thank you for clarifying." Lester moved to the place where interviews either recover or reveal themselves. Let me ask about the work you are doing now, he said. Advocacy, production, projects that define the present rather than the past. For a moment, the air eased. She spoke about a foundation initiative, about storytelling as healing, about women's voices in rooms that have long been locked. She spoke fluently, with the cadence of someone who has learned the choreography of conviction on camera. He listened, interjecting only to draw out specificity. Numbers, partnerships, outcomes. The conversation found a shallow harbor. Then he made the choice all serious interviewers must eventually make. He pointed the questions where contradictions have been rumored to live. Many admired the courage it took to step away, he said. Others have noticed the continued embrace of public platforms, interviews, deals, books. They say it looks less like escape and more like rebranding within the same light. How do you see that? Rebranding. She turned the word over as if it were defective. That is a tabloid frame. I am not a product. I do not owe anyone silence because I left an outdated system. I told my story on my terms. That is not marketing, that is dignity. He nodded once, acknowledging the claim without endorsing it. When a story is told publicly, he said, it does invite scrutiny. Does accountability feel fair to you when applied to your choices, as well as to the institution you criticize? Accountability is a word that becomes what it touches. Her eyes cooled. Interesting how accountability always seems to flow one way. Toward me, rarely toward the machine that did the harm. He let the sentence stand alone. Then he asked the question that would sit at the center of the night whether he spoke it or not. You have invoked the late Princess Diana as a figure of empathy for what relentless attention can do. Many draw parallels. Do you feel a connection to her legacy? The name landed like a stone in deep water. Her jaw hardened. Diana's legacy should not be a prop. I am not Diana. The comparison is lazy. She deserves better than that. He did not argue the sacred. I asked about connection, he said quietly, not replacement, given the similar pressures. She cut the distance again. Do you want tears? Do you want a clip? I will not exploit tragedy to validate myself. The control room shifted to a slightly wider shot, letting the table and the darkness claim more screen. Lester folded his hands in his lap and sat a fraction straighter. This was no longer a conversation with smooth edges. It was an examination of patience and posture. He kept his voice even. Let us place the monarchy aside entirely for a moment. Let us talk about the present. Your voice has become central in public debates about privacy, race, media power. Some people say your manner of communicating is dismissive of those who once admired you. Do you worry about that? Dismissive, she repeated, or perhaps the truth simply makes people uncomfortable. I am not here to be palatable. The sentence hit the black walls and returned with more force. The chairs felt closer together. The glasses of water looked suddenly theatrical, props in a play about thirst. Lester's eyes narrowed by a millimeter. He pivoted again, determined to find the trail that would take them both back to firm ground. Let me ask about your husband. Many respect the choice he made. Some say he sacrificed more. Family, role, country. How do you see his journey? Her back straightened. Harry made his choice because he is strong. Do not imply I dragged him. He is not a boy who wandered after a bright thing. He is a man who saw clearly and acted. Do you ever worry that your voice overshadows his? He asked, careful with each syllable. That your story dominates his. Overshadows. She let the word sit, then set it on fire. Or maybe people are unaccustomed to a woman occupying the center of her own narrative. Maybe that is the problem. He breathed slow. I do not question your right to your story, he said. The public struggles with what look like contradictions, rejecting a crown while using the platform it built, demanding privacy while signing deals that reveal private life. These questions exist. Contradictions or complexity, she shot back. Nuance does not sell. You prefer boxes, villain, saint, anything but human. His composure was a garment he had tailored over years. For a second, a seam pulled. He let the silence expand until it was large enough to change the subject by itself. Then he asked the question that separates dialogue from performance. Do you believe the choices you have made have brought you closer to peace? Her laugh was short and sharp. Peace is not something the media understands. I am not here to satisfy professional voyeurs. Peace is mine with or without your approval. He placed his cards aside, a quiet surrender to the fact that notes would not be helpful inside this weather system. His voice lowered, gaining not volume but gravity. Yet you are here, another program, another night. If peace were settled, would you need this light? For the first time, the mask cracked by a centimeter, her lips flattened, and for the first time, a hint of heat flickered under his calm. He leaned forward. Enough, Meghan. He did not raise his voice. The word carried its own altitude. I have tried to keep this respectful. The viewers expect an honest exchange. Dismissiveness is not honesty. He did not list the names he had interviewed. He did not roll out his resume as a shield. He simply returned to the ground he could defend. Respect flows both ways, or a conversation cannot stand. She stared at him, calculation and surprise warring in her eyes. Insulting, she said at last, softer and sharper than before. What is insulting is being dragged through the same grinder and told to smile while doing it. He did not blink. What is not acceptable is treating every question as an attack and every context as a trap. You speak often of truth. Truth expects to be examined. The silence that followed was the heaviest of the night. You could hear the faint whir of the pedestal camera and the tap of the director's finger on the console. Had there been an audience, someone would have coughed. Instead, there was only the black and the light and the two of them, held inside the rectangle that would soon live on millions of screens. She drew herself up, a fortress building its last wall. Then let us examine your truth, she said. The press has profited from my pain. When I speak, you call it performance. When I'm silent, you call it calculation. There is no good faith here. There can be, he said, but it cannot exist beside contempt. The floor manager lifted a hand in the darkness, a silent cue for time. The director ignored it. No one cuts away when history starts writing without help. Lester glanced once at the lens and then back at her, as if to acknowledge the third person in the room. He returned to the smallest words, the ones that carry the most weight. Why are you here, Meghan? For a heartbeat, she did not answer. Then the truth arrived, complicated and simple at once. Because if I do not speak, others will speak for me. Then speak, he said, but do not spit. It was not a rebuke delivered for applause. It was a line drawn by a man who built a career on lines that hold. Her eyes flashed. She took in breath. He waited. Somewhere in the dark, a red tally light dipped and rose as a second camera found a more honest angle. The studio seemed to lean in. The city beyond the walls moved in its usual patterns, unaware that a quiet room without an audience was busy manufacturing a night people would parse for years. The conversation had begun as a measured exchange. Now it was a test of who would keep their center when the floor moved. The air inside the NBC studio was growing thicker, not because of the heat, but because the silence between each question had started to weigh more than the questions themselves. The hum of the overhead lights felt louder, the kind of noise that made every pause ring like a warning bell. Lester Holt, the man known for his composure, adjusted his tie slightly, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that revealed the strain of navigating a conversation that was no longer an interview. Across from him, Meghan Markle leaned back in her chair, legs crossed, one hand resting lightly on her knee. Every movement was calculated, every glance a performance of control. But there was something sharper underneath, defensiveness disguised as poise. She was not just answering questions tonight, she was defending an entire narrative, one she believed she owned. Lester looked down at his notes again. The paper seemed heavier than usual. It wasn't that the questions were hostile, they were fair, honest. But honesty, he was learning, had no safe space in this studio. He looked up. Let's take a step back, he said, his tone calm, professional. You've spoken publicly about mental health, about the challenges of being under constant media scrutiny. How have those experiences shaped your understanding of accountability, both from the media and from yourself? It was a careful question, neutral on the surface, layered beneath. He expected reflection, maybe a measured response. Instead, Meghan's expression hardened instantly. Accountability, she repeated, her tone flat but icy. That's an interesting word, Lester. It's usually the one people use when they're trying to assign blame, usually to me. Lester remained silent, giving her space. She continued, voice rising slightly. Let me ask you something. Where is the accountability for the people who twist stories, who publish lies, who profit off pain? Where's their accountability? Because every time that word comes up, it's directed at me, as if I've done something wrong by simply existing. Her words cut through the air like glass. Lester nodded once, his expression neutral, though his eyes flickered with thought. You've been in the public eye for years, he said evenly. You understand how perception and accountability can get tangled, but do you feel that some of your choices, like the interviews, the documentaries, the memoirs, might also invite scrutiny? Meghan gave a small, cold laugh. Invite scrutiny? Lester, I didn't invite anything. I responded to it. There's a difference. I didn't knock on the world's door begging for attention. It was already there, pounding on mine. The sound of her voice echoed faintly in the hollow studio. Her words had rhythm, conviction, but they also had friction. They didn't fit neatly into the space they occupied. Lester took a breath, his voice as steady as ever. But when you respond publicly, he said, it becomes part of the story. That's inevitable. You've built a platform that amplifies your voice, and with that platform comes responsibility. She smiled thinly. Ah, responsibility, another word that only seems to apply to me. Tell me, Lester, how often does the media hold itself responsible for the damage it causes? Lester's lips pressed into a faint line. He had interviewed dictators, senators, and CEOs, people who wielded power like a weapon, and yet none had managed to twist his questions quite like this. But he refused to let irritation take the wheel. The press is far from perfect, he said, but you and I both know that scrutiny isn't always an attack. Sometimes it's a mirror. Meghan's expression didn't shift, her voice lowered. And sometimes it's a weapon. There it was, the first real strike of the night. Her words lingered, heavier than any headline. Lester sat still, considering. He could have diffused it with politeness, moved on, kept the peace. But he'd been doing this too long to let a conversation become theater. You're right, he said finally. Words can be weapons. But they can also be tools for understanding. The question is, what are you using yours for tonight? The air seemed to tighten. For the first time, Meghan didn't respond immediately. Her eyes flickered toward the camera, then back to him. The audience at home wouldn't see hesitation, they'd see calculation. She was weighing her next move, deciding whether to escalate or retreat. She chose escalation. I'm using my words, she said coolly, to speak my truth. Something I thought journalists valued, or does honesty only count when it fits the story you want to tell? Lester's gaze sharpened. Honesty always counts, he said, but honesty doesn't mean being immune to difficult questions. You've built a brand on transparency. Doesn't that require openness, even when it's uncomfortable? Meghan leaned forward, her voice rising. Transparency doesn't mean I owe anyone access to every part of my life. I'm not a public property, Lester. I'm a human being who's had enough of people like you dissecting every breath I take. The tension cracked audibly like ice underfoot. In the control room, a producer whispered something into a headset, something about cutting to break, but the director shook his head. They both knew what this was now. Television lightning. Lester's eyes stayed locked on hers. People like me, he said slowly. I've asked hard questions of everyone, from presidents to protesters. I treat every guest with respect. But respect goes both ways, Meghan. Her lips parted. And what exactly about this feels respectful to you? This conversation, he said, this opportunity. You came here to be heard, and you're being heard. But when every question becomes an accusation in your mind, that's not dialogue. That's defensiveness. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. For a long moment, Meghan didn't move. Her jaw flexed once. Then she gave a soft, humorless laugh. You really think this is about defensiveness? She said. No, Lester. This is about survival. Every question I answer gets turned into another headline, another cycle of outrage, another reason for people to hate me. And somehow, I'm supposed to sit here and smile through it all. That's what they want, isn't it? Lester's voice softened just slightly. Who is they, Meghan? Her eyes flicked to the lens again. Everyone, she said quietly. The institution, the media, the viewers who think they know me because they read 2 articles and watched a Netflix trailer. Everyone who's decided who I am before I even open my mouth. Her words might have drawn sympathy in another setting, but tonight the air was too charged for pity. There was something theatrical about her phrasing, too polished, too precise. And Lester, a man trained to detect performance from truth, could sense it. He leaned forward. Do you think, he asked gently, that perhaps the reason people struggle to connect with you is because you sound like you're always on defense? Always proving something? Meghan's expression cracked for just a moment, barely visible, but there. A flash of irritation, maybe even insecurity. Then it vanished behind another mask. I don't need to prove anything, she said coolly. People project their insecurities onto me. That's not my burden to carry. Lester nodded, but this time his patience was thinning. The calm professionalism was still there, but it was starting to solidify into something colder. I've interviewed hundreds of people in my career, he said slowly. Some of them have faced unimaginable pain, scrutiny, and loss. But the ones who move people, who earn empathy, do so because they allow themselves to be vulnerable, not invincible. Meghan's eyes narrowed. So I'm not vulnerable enough for you? I'm saying, Lester replied evenly, that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's honesty without armor. Right now, all I see is armor. The words landed like a hammer wrapped in velvet. For a long moment, Meghan didn't respond. Her eyes darted slightly toward the side where one of her aides watched from the shadows. The aide's expression was unreadable, but the tension was visible even there, in the clenched hands and the tight jaw. Meghan exhaled sharply through her nose, the sound small but sharp. Maybe I wear armor, she said finally, because I've learned that people love to watch women bleed. Lester didn't interrupt. The line was powerful. He knew it would trend by morning, but he also knew it wasn't entirely true. Maybe, he said softly, but people also respect those who stand firm without striking everyone who tries to talk to them. She turned her head, eyes narrowing again. Are you accusing me of being hostile? I'm observing, he replied. Meghan gave a short, brittle laugh. You sound just like the rest of them, so polite while you undermine me, so calm while you question my integrity. I haven't questioned your integrity, Lester said. I've questioned your consistency. And that's not the same thing. Her lips pressed together in a thin line. The cameras caught everything, the micro-expressions, the cracks forming behind the smile, the flicker of anger that flashed across her face. Lester continued, voice firm now. You talk about wanting to move forward, but you keep pulling every conversation backward, to blame, to bitterness. People don't want a royal scandal anymore. They want growth. They want humility. They want to see that the woman who walked away from the palace didn't just trade one throne for another. The words hit like an earthquake. Meghan froze, her body tensed, shoulders tightening, hands clasping the edge of her chair. So that's what this is, she said finally, her tone clipped. You want humility. You want the nice, quiet duchess who smiles and says thank you while she's torn apart. I'm not that woman, Lester. I never will be. Lester's gaze didn't waver. No one's asking for quiet, he said calmly. But strength without grace isn't strength. It's arrogance. The silence that followed was absolute. No one in the control room moved. The crew stared at their monitors like witnesses at a trial. Meghan's face went still. Not expressionless, just still, the kind of stillness that means emotion has moved beyond speech. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with anger held in check. You know, she said slowly, I came here thinking NBC would finally offer a platform for truth. But this isn't journalism, Lester. This is judgment. You've sat there pretending to be neutral while throwing stones behind a smile. Lester leaned forward, resting his hands calmly on his knees. And you've sat here pretending to be transparent while hiding behind resentment. For the first time all evening, Meghan's composure broke. Her eyes widened and the faint tremor in her hand betrayed her. You don't know me, she said, her voice rising. You don't know what I've endured. You don't get to tell me who I am or what I've hidden. I'm not telling you who you are, he said quietly. I'm asking you to see the difference between being misunderstood and being unaccountable. Her response came fast, sharp, and venom-laced. You don't get to lecture me about accountability, Lester. You're part of the same machine that profits off tearing people down. So spare me the moral high ground. The line hit hard, but Lester didn't flinch. He had been in this arena too long to lose control now. Then why are you here? He asked again, his tone low, deliberate. If you believe this platform is so corrupt, why keep stepping into the light? Meghan's breath caught. Her face hardened. She straightened in her chair. Because I refuse to be silenced. Because if I don't speak, people like you will keep rewriting my story for me. Lester nodded slightly, a gesture that was part empathy, part final warning. Then maybe you should focus on telling it instead of defending it. Meghan stared at him, speechless for a moment. The camera zoomed closer, capturing the faint tremor in her jaw, the quiet fury building in her eyes. You really think you can sit there and talk down to me? She said finally, her tone trembling with rage. You think you can wrap it up in polite words and pretend it's professionalism, but all you're doing is proving every reason I left that world behind. This isn't the palace, Lester replied. This is journalism. And in journalism, you don't control the narrative, you contribute to it. Her mouth fell open slightly, stunned by the audacity of the statement. For a moment, she seemed genuinely speechless. The control booth remained silent. No one dared cut. They all knew what they were witnessing, an interview turning into a reckoning. Lester looked directly into the lens, then back at her. His tone was calm again, but the calm was no longer gentle. It was final. I've spoken with presidents, soldiers, mothers who've lost children, people who've faced things that could break the soul, and they sat in that same chair with humility. Tonight, you've shown the opposite. You've mistaken confrontation for courage. Meghan's breath hitched audibly. How dare you? Lester interrupted, not with volume, but with authority. No, Meghan, how dare you come here claiming to want honesty when you've done everything to avoid it? The studio fell silent. Meghan blinked rapidly, fighting to steady herself. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time that evening, she looked shaken. Lester leaned back slowly, the faintest look of disappointment crossing his face. I think, he said softly, we both know this conversation isn't about truth anymore. It's about pride, and pride never makes for good news. He glanced toward the director, signaling the end of the segment. The red tally light blinked off. But the silence between them remained heavy, an unspoken admission that the real story had just begun. The camera stopped rolling, but no one moved. Not yet. Everyone in the room knew what they had just captured. A calm man of reason, a royal of controversy, and a collision that had nothing to do with questions and everything to do with ego. The cameras stopped rolling, or at least that's what everyone thought. In reality, one remained on standby, silently capturing the seconds after the segment was called. It was in those seconds that everything truly unraveled. The NBC studio, moments ago bright with professional composure, now felt suffocating. The air was charged, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. Crew members avoided eye contact. A floor manager whispered something about a reset, but the words fell flat. Even the lights seemed uncertain, glowing too bright, too white, like witnesses unwilling to look away. Lester Holt sat motionless in his chair, his hands clasped, his gaze steady. His expression gave nothing away, yet the air around him felt heavier, anchored by a kind of quiet disappointment. Across from him, Meghan Markle sat in rigid silence, her jaw tight, her chest rising and falling faster than before. Her earlier calm had curdled into something brittle, something dangerous. She looked at him the way a storm looks at a coastline, deciding whether to pull back or strike again. Are we done here? She asked finally, breaking the silence. Her tone wasn't a question, it was a challenge. Lester didn't answer right away. We're off the record for a moment, he said calmly. If you'd like to step out, you're welcome to. Meghan's eyes narrowed. Step out? You mean walk away? That's convenient. A man interrupts me, talks over me, and when I call it out, suddenly I'm being told to leave. I didn't tell you to leave, Lester replied evenly. I offered you a moment to breathe. There's a difference. The tension returned, thick and unrelenting. Meghan leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her voice low but sharp. You think I need to breathe, Lester? You think I'm emotional, fragile? You're exactly like the rest of them, pretending to be composed while talking down to me. Lester took a measured breath. The years had taught him when to step back and when to hold firm. I think, he said slowly, that the only thing I've done tonight is ask questions that millions of people want answers to. Millions of people want a spectacle, she shot back. They don't want truth. They want to see me stumble. They want to see me broken. Truth, he said quietly, and humility aren't opposites, Meghan. You can have both. Her laugh was quick and cruel, an exhale of disbelief. Humility, right? That's easy for you to say from your pedestal of judgment. I've spent years being torn apart, vilified, mocked, and you sit there, calm and collected, pretending your hands are clean. Lester finally leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table between them. The camera light caught the faint sheen on his glasses. I've never claimed to be clean, he said, his voice steady but firm, but I do my job with respect. That's all I've asked for tonight, Meghan's chin lifted defiantly. Respect goes both ways. It does, he agreed, and somewhere between your answers and your accusations, you forgot that. The sentence landed like a quiet explosion. Meghan blinked, startled, not by the words, but by the tone. Lester's calm had changed. It wasn't distant anymore, it was deliberate, controlled. The kind of calm that comes when a person stops defending and starts deciding. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "You heard me," Lester said. "I've interviewed heads of state who handled tougher questions with grace. I've spoken to people grieving unthinkable losses who still found the humanity to stay civil. And yet, here we are, arguing over the idea that accountability is an insult." "You're comparing me to politicians and victims?" she snapped. "I'm comparing you," he said, "to adults who understand the weight of their own words." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint buzz of the lights and the hum of the cameras still idling. A producer took one careful step toward the set, but Lester raised his hand slightly, a silent command to stay back. This wasn't over yet. Meghan looked down at the floor, her jaw flexing. When she looked up again, her expression had hardened into something rehearsed. "I came here because I believed NBC would give me a fair platform," she said, her tone suddenly smooth, practiced. "But instead, I'm being attacked on national television." "You wanted a moment. You got it. No one attacked you," Lester replied evenly. "But deflection doesn't equal clarity. You came here asking for a platform to share your truth. All I've done is ask what that truth looks like." Her voice rose. "It looks like survival. It looks like a woman standing up for herself in a world that can't stand strong women. But of course, you wouldn't understand that." Lester tilted his head. "I understand strong people, Meghan. I've spent my career interviewing them. What I see tonight isn't strength. It's fear dressed as defiance that hit like a lightning strike." Meghan's breath caught, her lips parting in disbelief. "Fear?" she repeated, as if the word itself offended her. "Do I look afraid to you?" "No," he said quietly. "You look angry. And sometimes anger is what people use to cover fear." She stared at him, speechless for a heartbeat. Then the fury came rushing back. "You're unbelievable," she said, standing up abruptly. "You sit there, hiding behind your calm act, thinking that makes you superior. But you're no different from every journalist who's ever tried to twist my words." Lester didn't stand. He looked up at her from his chair, unflinching. "If that's what you believe, you're welcome to walk out. But remember, no one twisted your words tonight but you." The silence that followed was electric. Every crew member froze, unsure whether to look away or bear witness. Meghan stood rigid, her hands clenched at her sides, her voice shaking as she spoke. "You think you can lecture me on truth? You, who sit in your comfortable chair, asking safe questions behind studio walls. You don't know what it's like to be hunted, to be judged for every breath you take." Lester finally rose to his feet, slow, deliberate. He wasn't a tall man by Hollywood standards, but in that moment, his presence seemed to fill the room. "I don't know your pain," he said softly, "but I know integrity. And what you've shown tonight isn't it." Meghan's eyes flashed. "Integrity? You think you have the right to question mine?" "I think," he said calmly, "that the moment you confuse criticism with cruelty, you lose sight of the difference between truth and ego." She stared at him, speechless. The fury that had carried her through the night faltered under the weight of his steadiness. It wasn't the volume of his voice, it was the stillness of it, the way it seemed to draw the air out of the room until there was nowhere left to hide. Then came the words that would echo long after the cameras stopped rolling. "You claim to want your story told," Lester said quietly, "but you don't want a story, you want validation. And that's not journalism, that's theater." The room froze. Even the lights seemed to hesitate. For the first time that evening, Meghan's mask cracked wide open. Her lips trembled, her composure shattered. "You," she began, her voice catching, "you don't get to belittle me." "I'm not belittling you," he said softly. "I'm holding you to the same standard as everyone else who sits in that chair. Truth doesn't bend for privilege." Her face reddened, her breathing quickened. "You're crossing a line, Lester." "I'm drawing one," he replied, "because at some point, respect has to mean more than image. You've spoken of strength, of truth, of freedom, but all I've seen tonight is someone desperate to control a story that's already written itself." The words struck her like a slap. Her voice trembled now, not from fear, but rage. "You think you can define my story? You think you can stand there and decide what the truth is?" "No," Lester said, his tone even. I think you already did. You just don't like how it sounds. For a long, unbearable moment, the studio was silent. Every camera stood still. Every person held their breath. Then Meghan reached for her microphone pack, her movements jerky, her eyes wet with fury. This interview is over, she said sharply. Lester didn't stop her. He simply nodded once, as though confirming something he'd known from the start. If that's your choice, he said quietly, then make it with the same confidence you came in with. She hesitated. Her hand trembled slightly as she pulled off the mic. Then she straightened her shoulders, gathering what was left of her dignity. I will, she said through clenched teeth, because I don't need your platform. Or your approval. She turned sharply, her heels striking the floor in crisp, echoing clicks. The sound reverberated off the walls, measured, furious, final. She didn't look back. The camera that had never been turned off followed her as she walked across the darkened studio. Her silhouette passed through the beams of light, shrinking until she disappeared into the shadows near the exit. The door opened with a sharp click, and then it closed. The sound was soft, but it carried the weight of finality. The studio stayed silent for several seconds after she was gone. Then, quietly, a producer whispered, "We're clear." But no one moved, not the crew, not the director, not Lester. He remained standing in the same spot, his hands clasped in front of him, eyes fixed on the empty chair across from him. The chair that still held the imprint of the person who had filled it, now just a hollow symbol of what had unraveled. Finally, Lester exhaled. Slowly, deeply, the kind of exhale that comes after walking through fire. He looked toward the floor manager. Are we still rolling? A pause, then a hesitant nod. One camera still is, the man said softly. Good, Lester replied. Leave it. He turned to face the camera fully, straightening his jacket, his face calm, but his eyes heavy with disappointment. The transformation from man to anchor was seamless, muscle memory after years of discipline. He spoke quietly, but the words carried the authority of someone who had earned every ounce of respect he commanded. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his tone solemn, you've just witnessed a moment that wasn't planned. And perhaps it shouldn't have happened this way. But I believe it says something about where we are, not as journalists or celebrities, but as people. He paused. The control room stayed silent. There's a danger, he continued, in confusing personal narrative with universal truth. There's a danger in mistaking victimhood for virtue. Tonight, what you saw was not a battle between journalist and guest. It was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when pride replaces perspective. The camera stayed locked on him. No music, no graphics, just words. He drew a breath, his tone softening. In my years at this desk, I've spoken with people from every corner of the world. I've seen power crumble, courage rise, and grief reshape entire nations. But one thing remains the same. Truth doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to control the room. It stands quietly, even when everything else falls apart. He looked down for a moment, then back into the camera. This conversation was supposed to be about understanding. Instead, it became a confrontation. I regret that. But I don't regret holding space for honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. The words hung in the air like smoke, calm, controlled, devastating. He ended with a faint nod, the kind that anchors use when something needs no further explanation. We'll be right back, he said quietly. The feed cut to black, but the moment lived on. In the control room, no one spoke. They all knew what they had just captured would ripple across the world. The segment wouldn't air unedited, NBC would make sure of that. But clips would leak. Words would spread, viewers would debate. Some would say Lester Holt had been too harsh, others would call it the most dignified dismantling of arrogance ever broadcast. And somewhere behind the closed doors of her car, Meghan Markle sat in silence, her reflection in the tinted window staring back at her. For the first time that night, there were no cameras, no lines to deliver, no applause to anticipate, just her. And the echo of a man's calm voice saying what no one else had dared. Truth doesn't bend for privilege. The night the interview aired, the world didn't just watch, it dissected. Every blink, every breath, every tremor of voice was frozen, looped, slowed, and analyzed. Within an hour of broadcast, hashtags had already begun to climb across social media. Hashtag Lester versus Meghan, hashtag the NBC showdown, hashtag truth and privilege. But long before the world reacted, the NBC headquarters sat in stunned silence. In the control room, no one spoke for several seconds after the feed cut to black. The silence felt almost sacred, like the quiet that follows a storm that's torn through everything in its path. Monitors still glowed with frozen images, Lester Holt standing under the studio lights, his expression a portrait of calm authority. Meghan Markle, mid-step, retreating toward the door. The director finally exhaled. "Well," he muttered, running a hand through his hair, "that's not the interview we planned." A young producer leaned forward, eyes wide. "Do we air it as is?" Everyone looked at Lester. He stood by the edge of the stage, arms folded, still staring at the empty chair across from him. His face was unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience. Not anger, not pride, just the calm understanding that history had already written itself. "We don't sensationalize it," he said firmly. "We show it honestly. Start to finish. No cuts." The director hesitated. "Lester, that was the truth," he interrupted, "and the truth doesn't need editing." He turned and walked away, his polished shoes echoing against the floor. Crew members parted silently to let him pass. The anchor who had covered wars, disasters, and elections had just lived through a different kind of battleground. One fought not with weapons, but with words. Outside, Manhattan pulsed with its usual indifference. Taxi lights, wind, the rhythm of a city too busy to care about television until the screens lit up. But that night, every diner, every apartment, every airport lounge tuned into one thing: the confrontation. NBC Nightly News didn't tease it, it didn't dramatize it. It simply played the segment in full, just as it happened. By the time the credits rolled, the internet was on fire. Clips flooded X, TikTok, YouTube. Lester Holt puts Meghan Markle in her place. Meghan's meltdown on live TV. But not everyone saw it that way. Supporters of Meghan flooded social platforms, defending her fiercely. They accused Lester of being patronizing, of framing her unfairly, of attacking a woman who's already endured enough. Commentators argued endlessly. Was he too firm or was she too fragile? Was it journalism or judgment? Within hours, the interview wasn't just a broadcast, it was a cultural fault line. Meanwhile, in a quiet hotel suite overlooking the city, Meghan sat alone. The room was dim, the curtains drawn, the faint glow of her phone casting light across her face. Messages poured in from her team, her publicist, even her husband, who was thousands of miles away on another engagement. She didn't read most of them. Instead, she stared at the replay. The clip had already been uploaded by someone, probably a staffer at the network. It was everywhere now. Every expression magnified, every sentence dissected. When Lester said, "Truth doesn't bend for privilege," the camera had caught her face, blank, stunned, momentarily vulnerable. That was the frame being shared across the world. Her publicist called again. She ignored it. The silence in the room was unbearable. The only sound was the muffled hum of New York outside. She pressed her palms against her temples and let out a quiet, shaky breath. How had it all gone so wrong? She had come prepared, polished, armed with answers, ready to redirect, to control. But control had slipped through her fingers the moment Lester refused to play her game. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't mocked, he had simply stood firm. That made it worse. He'd made her look small without ever raising his voice. Her phone buzzed again. She picked it up this time, not to answer, but to scroll. The headlines had already turned ruthless. NBC interview implodes. Meghan walks out. Lester Holt's lesson in Grace Under Fire. Royal rhetoric meets reality. Her name was everywhere again, but not how she wanted. She shut the phone off and stared out the window. Down below, people hurried along the sidewalks. Cars streamed past. Life continued. Uncaring, unshaken. For the first time in years, Meghan felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not self-righteousness, just the hollow echo of lost control. Back at NBC headquarters, Lester's office was quiet. He sat by the window, jacket off, tie loosened, a mug of coffee cooling beside a stack of papers he wasn't reading. The city below glowed like an ocean of lights, indifferent to the storm his interview had unleashed. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't regretting. He was reflecting. In all his years behind the desk, through hurricanes, elections, and human tragedies, he had learned that sometimes the most volatile interviews weren't with politicians or generals, but with people who couldn't tell the difference between exposure and expression. Meghan Markle hadn't been the first guest to confuse scrutiny for cruelty, but she had been one of the few to try and turn accountability into victimhood on live television. He replayed the moment in his head, her standing, shaking, accusing him of being just like the rest of them, the anger in her voice, the look in her eyes, and then her silence when he said the one thing she couldn't refute. Truth doesn't bend for privilege. He hadn't planned that line. It had simply arrived, the kind of clarity that only comes when patience runs out but professionalism stays. He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "God help me," he murmured under his breath. His assistant knocked lightly on the door. "Lester?" He looked up. "Yes?" "They're already talking about a morning segment," she said. "Everyone wants your take." He gave a small shake of his head. "No, I said what needed saying, but the response—" "I'm not feeding the fire," he interrupted gently. "The story will tell itself." She hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." When she left, the room fell quiet again. He turned back to the window and watched the faint fog rise over the Hudson. His reflection stared back at him, calm, tired, resolute. In a world where everyone shouted to be heard, silence was still the strongest punctuation. By morning, the reaction was everywhere. Major outlets covered it with urgency usually reserved for political scandals. The Washington Post ran an op-ed titled, "When a Journalist Refuses to Bow." The Guardian called it a masterclass in grace under pressure. Even the Times in London, usually careful about royal commentary, published a blistering column questioning whether Meghan's media crusades had finally reached their breaking point. On cable news, clips played on loop. Analysts praised Holt for remaining calm while holding a mirror to entitlement. Others defended Meghan, accusing Holt of being condescending, of tone policing. But even those defenses sounded hesitant, more out of loyalty than belief. The public was divided, but the verdict was clear: something had shifted. The myth of Meghan Markle, the misunderstood victim, the silenced voice, the symbol of defiance, had cracked. And it had cracked under the softest hammer imaginable: composure. 3 days later, NBC released the full, uncut version online, exactly as Lester had requested. Within 24 hours, it had 40 million views. The comment section read like a referendum. "Lester Holt just gave a masterclass in journalism. That's how you handle arrogance, with calm truth." This wasn't an interview. It was an intervention, but buried among the thousands of reactions was one comment that stood out, quiet, almost lost in the flood. She didn't need to lose the argument. She just needed to listen. It had a few hundred likes, no profile picture, just words. But those words captured what millions felt watching the exchange unfold. Inside NBC headquarters, executives were already fielding calls from major outlets. Invitations flooded in for Lester to appear on late-night shows, podcasts, even international interviews, but he declined them all. "I don't need to explain the truth," he told his assistant. It spoke for itself. He wasn't interested in viral moments. He was interested in standards, and somewhere deep down, he knew that this wasn't just about Meghan Markle. It was about the kind of journalism he'd spent his life defending. Journalism that didn't flatter, journalism that didn't bend. That night, as the building emptied and the city quieted, Lester stayed behind in his office. On his desk, a small note from a viewer sat beside his coffee mug. No name, just handwriting. "Thank you for reminding us what integrity looks like on television." He smiled faintly and folded the note into his pocket. Across the country, Meghan's team scrambled. Damage control meetings filled her calendar. Statements were drafted, then redrafted, until every word sounded hollow. "Maybe we should frame it as media bias," one advisor said. "Or gendered criticism," another suggested. "Or maybe," her publicist said carefully, "we should say nothing at all." That last idea hung in the air like a foreign language. Silence wasn't something Meghan understood. But this time, for once, she didn't argue. She simply nodded, eyes down, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The clip played silently on a nearby monitor. Lester's calm voice, her own rising defensiveness, the look on her face as he said that line. Truth doesn't bend for privilege. She'd tried to drown it out with anger. But the more she fought it, the louder it became. That night, she sat in bed scrolling through her phone again, watching the debate unfold online. For the first time, she didn't feel the rush of controlling the narrative. She felt the exhaustion of chasing it. There was a difference between speaking your truth and trying to control everyone else's version of it. And she was only now beginning to understand that difference. Weeks later, the world moved on, as it always does. The headlines shifted. Another scandal, another celebrity, another storm. But the interview remained. It became one of those cultural touchstones people remembered not for the spectacle, but for the stillness within it. Media schools analyzed it. Professors played it in classrooms as an example of composure under fire. "Watch this," they'd say. "This is how you hold your ground when the room tilts." As for Lester, he never spoke publicly about that night again. He didn't need to. His silence was its own statement, the kind that says everything. And Meghan? She would return to the public eye months later, more subdued, more careful. The edge that had once defined her had dulled. In later interviews, she avoided confrontation, often pausing before answering, as though haunted by the echo of one man's voice reminding her of something she had forgotten. That dignity doesn't live in dominance. It lives in grace. On the one-year anniversary of the interview, a journalist asked Lester Holt if he remembered that night. He smiled softly and said, "Of course. You don't forget moments where truth stops being convenient." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The clip would live on, replayed in highlight reels, studied in broadcast training, quoted in think pieces, not because of scandal, but because of restraint, a calm voice, a steady gaze, and a reminder that even in an age of outrage, dignity can still win the room. In the end, the showdown wasn't really about Meghan Markle or Lester Holt. It was about the mirror their conversation held up to a culture addicted to performance, a culture that mistakes noise for conviction. What happened that night wasn't an explosion. It was something quieter, a correction. And when the dust finally settled, it wasn't the loudest voice that people remembered. It was the calm one that refused to bend.